I did. Oh no, this is fine actually.
Yeah, there you go. I got it.
Yeah.
I just gotta get rid of that.
Can't see what it says. You know, I'm just gonna turn the Wi-Fi off actually. Give me a second.
Cool.
Is that all that I have
Pause the
open?
timer.
I don't know where the mouse went. You know, we're gonna probably have to drink a Smirnoff Ice, right?
Is that a thing?
Yeah.
Is that like actually a thing? We confirmed that was a thing?
So make sure all my apps are closed. Yeah.
Yeah. Turning the Wi-Fi off is a good move.
What does that mean? I mean, we work for FireEye.
Well, yeah, but are you selling products?
No, we don't sell things. For the low price, no.
Yeah. So we're from the media team. So we do the services and consulting. We don't do product.
Okay, I didn't know if it was educational or like, these are services.
No.
Okay. You understand why they asked that question, but that's
Yeah. No, it's all good. Have you met Doug? Have you met Doug Dunwoody? Oh, introduce yourself.
Is this mine?
Yes, mine is on the floor. So don't. I'll walk all the way back there. This is a pretty good turnout for 10 o'clock on a Sunday.
Yeah. Considering I'm still half asleep.
Yeah, I know.
Ready? All right.
Good to go. All right. Hey, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for showing up. The Sunday morning talk. Yeah. Dragging your beautiful faces out of bed. My name's Austin. This is my associate Doug. We're from FireEye, but more specifically, we work for a company called Mandiant. So it's the consulting arm of FireEye. And we're here to talk to you about something that's very important. For those of you who have been to several talks already, the sort of sub-theme going through is that multi-factor authentication is actually really important. I know, it's a shocker. Try to contain your excitement. For things like secure domain administration, for example. And we're here to talk about things, techniques that we've developed, as well as things we've seen real-world attackers do to subvert multi-factor authentication, and then more importantly, give you tips and tricks on how to better protect yourself when it comes to MFA. So here's a little bit of the roadmap. We're going to talk specifically, sort of setting the stage about what MFA is, why it's important, why you can't afford not to have it. I know we still have conversations with companies that refuse to use multi-factor authentication in 2018. We developed a new threat model for MFA specifically for this talk because we found that while occasionally throwing out different attacks and bypasses over the last couple of years has been interesting, from a defender perspective, it's not very helpful. So we have to rigorously define it and the different steps and methodologies in order to approach defending it. And then, of course, we'll provide a little more details in terms of what your defenders can do.
Can everyone hear me in the back, or do I need to use the mic? Bad? Down? All right. So for everyone, my name is Doug Beanstalk, a.k.a. Doe, also DoSec on Twitter. I'm a senior consultant here at Mandiant. I've been here for 4 years now. I primarily live in New York City, but I've also spent some time in Amsterdam. I'm on both our incident response team and our red team lead. So that means that I get to learn really cool things about breaking them, and then I can turn around and help our clients fix them. I'm a lifelong Green Bay Packers fan, so if you want to talk about the second coming of Aaron Rodgers, just let me know. That's right. I'm also a cocktail enthusiast. Some people may have other terms for that, but I choose to go with cocktail enthusiast.
All right, and I am Austin Baker. I'm a principal consultant. I've been at Mandiant for 5 years. Just like Doug, I started out on the incident response side. Then I said, hey, it's really cool to hack stuff. Then I went to the red team. Then I said, hey, it's really cool to hack stuff, but we're outstripping the ability for customers to defend themselves against it. So I was like, okay, I'll do a little help on the blue side too. So now I'm sort of a weird purple team mix. I'm a longtime D&D DM, for those of you who play Dungeons & Dragons. I'm a proud cat owner. And, I try to live my life 1/4 mile at a time.
So what we're here to talk about today is kind of obvious. Two-factor security is super important. Everyone needs to have it. But unfortunately, it seems like even though it's 2018, we still at Mandiant, and probably all of you guys run into clients or maybe your own organization who say, well, listen, there's a lot of complexities with MFA, and we have these executives, or we don't really need it for webmail anymore because that's just in the cloud. But in fact, that's not true, right? Multi-factor is important for everything that you have that is internet accessible, and probably even for some of those critical internal assets. In fact, I spend a lot of my time now on the incident response side investigating Office 365 compromises, and I can say that probably 95% of them are due to the organization not having multi-factor enabled on their webmail, or having certain protocols available, which we're going to talk about later, which just don't support multi-factor, and they don't even know about it. And you're probably thinking, well, we're all forward-thinking security people. We're at DerbyCon. We all have two-factor security. I'm just going to leave. Well, hopefully in the next 45 minutes, you'll see why just setting up two-factor and forgetting about it is not enough anymore. So before we go down that route, I want to talk a little bit about what two-factor security actually is, because there's a lot of disagreement about what makes something secured by two-factor security. And the traditional definition would be, well, we have these 3 buckets of authentication types, and to be multi-factor, I need to choose at least one from 2 of these buckets. That first bucket is the traditional, something you know, so a password, the answer to a secret question, maybe, hopefully not. The second would be something you have. This is your phone or maybe your RSA hardware token. And the third would be something you are, so biometrics. Now, I know there's a lot of disagreement about whether or not biometrics count as a second factor. We're not going to touch that today. We're just going to assume it is for now. The problem with this definition is a lot of organizations forget key parts of it. They forget that part where you need to choose 2 things from 2 different buckets. Instead, many organizations do what we call double dipping. They're going to have something like a password, and then their second factor is maybe a 4-digit PIN that you also need to memorize. So that's double dipping. You actually don't have two-factor security if you're doing this.
So as we've done more and more testing on the red team side, we've realized that the frame of mind was always, once I get this thing set up and working, I never need to look at it ever again because it secures all the things. The problem is that was never acceptable, and especially now it's not, because attackers have wised up to this. There's a lot of, when you're installing it and setting it up, there's a lot of operational needs that you immediately get confronted with that attempt to undermine the security of multi-factor authentication from the get-go. So the first is exceptions. I know several large organizations that have exceptions applied to certain user accounts. Your CEO doesn't feel like looking at his phone every time he needs to check his email, so he says, hey, turn this off for me. Well, obviously that's an operational need. You kind of have to do what he says, but you want your CEO's email to have two-factor authentication. So there's always that push and pull. Same thing with administrative management. How do we actually administer MFA? Are we using AD accounts? Are we syncing those and logging in? Are we doing just cloud-based authentication? How do we manage the credentials? And then last but not least, help desk integration is a huge pain point, because nowadays it's actually really easy to call up the help desk and pretend to be a distraught user and say, hey, I got a new phone, or I poured coffee all over my phone. Can you help me set up my second factor? And the poor help desk people are just trying to get through the day and get through all the tickets they have to do. So again, it's a constant combat between operations and functionality and then security. So we know that going into this, it's very complex. MFA is very hard to deploy appropriately, but we hope that by discussing this and discussing all the techniques that we're about to dive into, we can get people set up for success. So we're going to just do a little bit of the history. So we've been doing research on this since 2015. And way back in 2015, we saw a lot of companies primarily using physical tokens. RSA tokens were the popular tool of choice. But we noticed that software and phone token usage was growing, and it's growing quite rapidly. And the obvious answer is because everything's in the cloud now. You can access everything via your phone apps plug into everything. You've got single sign-on, you've got webmail now. Everything's stored off-site. So you need a secure way to access it, and you can't send everyone a physical token in most organizations, because that's 250,000 physical tokens you'd have to send. So as we put more and more behind multi-factor authentication, attackers realized that they had to confront the problem head-on and develop techniques to get around it. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So in order to break it down in a way that's digestible, we split it up into a 3-stage model. So the first stage is pre-authentication. So this is the attacker essentially setting the trap. This is before any user is logged in, before any session has been created, techniques attackers can do to bypass multi-factor authentication and get access to a session. The second stage is after they have access to a single time-limited session, what can the attacker do to maintain multi-factor access to that account? And then finally, post-exploitation. This is assuming everything has gone wrong. You've lost domain admin credentials. They've compromised your entire environment from, say, the Active Directory side. How can an attacker use those credentials and that access to backdoor multi-factor authentication even further? So start at the beginning. This is how attackers get their foot in the door. This is the setup. What does the attacker have right now? So they have a target organization. They probably know what MFA product you're using. They've got users they're interested in going after. And they probably have user credentials. So during the red teams that we've done in the last couple of years, it has been increasingly common that we actually have a set of valid credentials before we even send the first phishing email, because third-party web compromises are the scourge of the internet, and everyone's passwords are being dumped from several sites every year. So usually we can come up with a set of valid credentials. Of course, the attacker has an objective. Our objective as the red team is to penetrate as far as possible and get access to the most sensitive systems. But most nation-state attackers are very particularly interested in a certain set of information. And then finally, and this is where the real problem comes, is that attackers have asymmetrical techniques, right? They only have to get one successful email. They don't need to get 100. Out of the batch of 1,000 they'll send, they only need one person to click and run something in order to get access to the environment. So now the attacker has one thing, and it's basically, how do I turn social engineering into multi-factor access? Well, whenever we try to set up our red teams and do it very strategically, we try to case the joint, right? Do our recon. And identifying the scheme that's currently in use is actually really simple. LinkedIn results, for example, your network admins saying what their background is and what tools they know how to use, or even job postings. I actually did a Google search last night for job postings that mentioned something like Duo or RSA. People are looking for people who have administrative skills in a particular tool set, and they're advertising it on the web, so you can tell exactly what kind of product the company is deploying. Additionally, you can use stolen credentials. So the picture here is an example of when you log in with a single factor set of credentials and you don't have an automated delivery mechanism defined for your account. So it gives you this nice little option where, I can select what phone I want it to go to, I can select which method I want. Well, this is really great for attackers because they can log in with the single factor credentials. It's not a failed login. They can say, this is good to know, and then they can just cancel and back out of it because now they know, hey, this is two-factor secured, and your user doesn't know their credentials have been compromised at this point. So attackers are going to be looking for, what's the MFA product? What is the source of the second factor, right? Is it a physical token? They can usually determine that based on how it asks for the second password or the second PIN. Is it a software token? What delivery mechanisms are supported? Is it just SMS? Do they do phone calls? Is it a push request? God forbid, do they allow you to send the token to an email account, which of course would mean the email is single factor authenticated? So when we're actually executing the attack, originally, back in the early days, 2015, 2014, we took a very simple approach. It was, hey, just pretend to be the guy they want to talk to. So we'd set up a site, duplicate their VPN or web login, and have them send their credentials to us, and then we would take those credentials and we would log into the legitimate site on their behalf, and we would finish the multi-factor authentication protocol with them. So if they sent us, put an SMS code in our website, we would put that into the target website. And at the end, we would just push the user off to another web page, say, oh, sorry, there was an error, and then we'd log in and we'd have an authenticated session. So this is really annoying to do because you have to do everything basically within the span of about 30 seconds. And if you miskey something or someone's not sitting there waiting like for 15 minutes straight just waiting for someone to enter something, you can miss that window. So a lot of red teams, ours included, have actually developed some tools that handle this process automatically.
So this problem gave us the tool called RealFish by two of our colleagues, Pan Chan and Trevor Haskell. And basically what it's relying on the fact that if you have a multi-factor authentication scheme and you're using token codes, those codes are probably valid for between 30 to 60 seconds. And this is just because we're all humans. We need time to read the token code, put it into the website, miss a digit, backspace, type it correctly. And this gives attackers a small but sufficient window to capture a code and replay it. And RealFish does all of that automatically. So it's going to sit on your phishing page, capture those credentials, send it somewhere that you can actually use them, and also distract the user at the same time. So what that's going to look like is you'll have your phishing page. Let's say it's your web-based VPN portal. It's going to be configured to accept the password, the username, and that second code. Let's say it's a PIN code. Once the victim user enters them in, it's going to be shuttled over an SSH tunnel to a consultant, a poor consultant who's just been waiting at their laptop for this to happen. RealFish is going to use some Selenium magic to launch a browser, authenticate on that victim user's behalf, and voila, you have your authenticated multi-factor session. On the other side of things, we're going to automatically authenticate the victim user as well, but with an incorrect password. And so that victim user, they get directed to their VPN portal with a message that says, incorrect username or password, please try again. They just think they fat-fingered it. We've all done that, and life goes on. But as you can imagine, this is still a little complex, even though it's automated, and you have to have some poor member of your team sit in front of their laptop 24 hours a day, just waiting for that authentication to happen. Yeah.
So, log in, and I might be stealing some of your thunder. If I am, I'm sorry. So, you guys log in, number one, tell them that that finger, they go log in number two. Are they going to get a warning, maybe, saying, hey, you logged in twice?
Yeah, that's a good point. They may not. It depends on how your organization has configured whatever asset that we're phishing against, right? Some organizations certainly have, you can only have one active VPN session, but a lot of them don't for whatever reason. Maybe developers need to have multiple machines, what have you. But yeah, that's definitely a concern.
Yeah, and you would be surprised at how many services are out there that don't actually tell you that you just kicked off a session that already existed, right? The user may seamlessly terminate the previous session and log in successfully, but they have no idea that they just terminated someone who was logged in as them and accessing their stuff.
So what other ways can we bypass multi-factor from a pre-authentication standpoint? Especially as organizations are moving towards the cloud, this was something extremely interesting to me. And so I started looking into, well, what are some ways that we can bypass this? It actually turns out, if you read some FireEye reports, that some APT groups actually stole my thunder, and they have been doing this for a little while now. But all of these cloud service providers, they give you the tools to create what are called third-party or integrated applications. And every cloud service provider has this, whether it's Office 365, G Suite, Box, Salesforce. They all give the ability for a developer to create an application that will then access data on your behalf, right? And the whole point is they want to drive synergy, they want to enhance productivity. Your sales guy doesn't want to have 6 tabs open, he wants to access Salesforce from Office 365. And the beauty of this is, by design, these applications are going to bypass multi-factor, because if you have an application running on a server, accessing someone else's data at all times legitimately, there's just no way that multi-factor works here. And the second really nice thing is that this access of the application, it's going to be valid for generally 90 days or more. And again, that's because this is a server application. The user doesn't want to be continually being asked to grant access to it. They just want to consent once and forget about it. So how does this work on the back end? On the back end, this is using a protocol called OAuth. I've copy and pasted the definition of OAuth there for you. You can read it at your leisure. In the terms of an OAuth flow, or what's called a web authentication flow, that's the one we care about, there's some parties and terms to be aware of. So the resource owner is just that end user, the person whose data is theirs. Then you're going to have the OAuth client, which is that third-party application seeking access. There will be an authorization server, also known as an identity server or an identity provider. And this is going to be the remote resource that's responsible for ensuring a user is who they say they are and issuing the tokens that an application actually needs to access that user's data. The resource server is where that data actually lives, usually the API endpoint. And then lastly is the scope, so the actual types of data that you're seeking access to. This may be read-write access over email or read-write access to OneDrive. So how does this actually work? How does a user go from just having an application out there to actually allowing that application to access their data? So there's a concept of consent. The user is going to receive, or they're going to find a consent link. They're going to click that link and they'll be taken to the authorization server. So it's important to know that this authorization server is a legitimate page on that legitimate cloud service provider's domain. So everything looks legit. We can see a nice little consent screen there. Note that there's not much information provided to the end user besides the data that's being accessed. And yeah, I mean, it looks legit. I would click yes to this. So how can we actually weaponize this? So we're calling malicious OAuth applications OAuth abuse. Anyone can create a free developer account on these cloud service providers, and they can instantiate these third-party applications. Then you get to go through a fun exercise of reading a lot of API documentation, learning all about OAuth and how to implement it, and maybe eventually you profit. So we've published a tool called Ponoth, which is just an open source modular platform for abusing OAuth. It provides a very nice, easy to use GUI for launching and managing these attacks. Just point and click and you can compromise users, you can search their inbox, you can upload files, you can send files, etc. And if this works, we'll have a quick little video just demonstrating it. So here I am at the Office 365 developer portal. I've created my application. It's going to be called Acme Corp Email Scanner. We can see what are called the callback or redirect URLs. So this is where the OAuth token gets sent. And then here's the graph permissions, also known as the scopes. So the types of data that I'm trying to access. Now inside of Ponoth, you can see I've entered in my application details. Don't worry, that secret's no longer valid. And we have our authorization URL. So that's the consent link I need a user to click. And we can see there's 3 users that have been compromised so far. Now in our next victim user, Alice, we can see she's received an action required email. She's being asked to run an email security scanner. She gets directed to Microsoft, authenticates. Here we go, not much. Email security scanner, yeah, it looks legit. I'm going to accept to it. Now she's going to get kicked out to Google. You can configure it to be whichever site you want as the landing page. If we go back into Ponoth, we can see that we have a new user, Alice. And we're going to see her OAuth details in a second. So here's the token that was captured. This is called the bearer token. It's what I need to actually access resources on her behalf. If I go down to messages, I'm going to search her inbox for the keyword important. Okay. Oh, nice. Subject, very important information. Here's the super top secret materials. Okay, that sounds interesting. Is there an attachment? Yes, there's an attachment, important.jpg. Well, I'm an attacker. I want to see what that attachment is. So I need to copy some information, just the IDs that are provided in this body. I'm going to paste them in. Oh, that's a nice pop-up. And there we go, important.jpg. Very important Paul Walker face. So yeah, it's very easy to use. You don't have to worry about the API. You don't have to worry about anything. And in fact, in coming weeks, we're going to be releasing a module for G Suite as well.
So of course, because we are picking on Exchange here, we do have to give them a shout out. Microsoft loves legacy support. Their philosophy is you don't turn your back on family, even when family is very insecure. So you've got several single factor protocols that are currently supported for backwards compatibility, ActiveSync, POP IMAT. Several old Office clients do this. And hey, for a long while it was, oh, if you have the single factor credentials, you can just pull mail directly from the web server. Well, then very smart MFA vendors and Microsoft caught on to this, and they said, no, no, no. If you are enrolled in two-factor authentication, you cannot use ActiveSync or EWS and things like that. Well, for backwards compatibility, they added the idea of app password. So once you're authenticated, I can set essentially what is a single factor password for a particular application so that now I can run something like, say, ActiveSync.
And just an anecdote, it's really important here to be aware of what protocols you're actually exposing if you're hosting Exchange or even if you're using Exchange Online, Office 365. I've done quite a few business email compromise cases recently where the organization has told me, well, we have multi-factor enabled, but we still have this Office 365 or this Office compromise, so here's the employee's laptop, there must be malware on it. Only to go back and say, well, actually, we still allow basic authentication, so the Nigerian prince just opened up Outlook 2007, which doesn't support modern authentication, and they were able to log right in with that username and password.
And of course, one thing we have to take a second and define exactly what MFA isn't, or as I like to call it, the find out what your high school mascot says about you problem. There are a lot of traps out there when you're setting up multi-factor authentication, especially if you're rolling your own. The most common one is using secret questions as the second factor. And the reason why is that secret questions are not so secret anymore. Social media basically means that if you find someone with a generally open profile, you can guess what their answers to questions are probably going to be. You can figure out who their family members are. You can do a lot of research about them. Also, common answers. So if you poll 100 people who their favorite athlete is, I guarantee you a significant portion will say something like LeBron James or Michael Jordan. Again, it's just about, or Aaron Rodgers. It's just about what the... Right, you could probably guess that was his answer, right? There you go. But attackers are getting wise to this, and they're actually deploying quizzes on sites like Facebook that are specifically designed to harvest your secret question answers. And so once you fill that quiz out thinking, my favorite season? Yeah, I'll answer this quiz. They get your name, they get your location, and they get the answer to your secret question. So odds are they can find a site where that information might be useful. Pins are a little better, but still fairly common, guessable. And at the end of the day, it's just another example of double dipping. You don't want to deploy two things that you know, category items for your factors, because it creates a single point of failure problem. And machine certificates are a good example of this. If your system is compromised, say via social engineering, you deploy a payload, I can use a keylogger to get your password. I could use a keylogger to get your PIN. I can use harvesting tools like Mimikatz to get machine certificates off that machine. So all I need is about an hour's worth of access to a machine, and I can essentially get all of the second factors of authentication that you might be using for that given user. The reason MFA is really powerful is because once you split those factors across different devices, then it becomes really difficult to get all of them. So if one factor is on your phone and the other factor is in your head or on your machine, well, the attacker has to do twice the amount of work in order to get access to all of those at the same time. Speaking of, phones have become a popular new target. There's a technique that's becoming increasingly useful called SIM swapping or SIM hijacking, where your attacker will show up to your local telephone store and pretend to be your account holder and say, hey, I need to transfer this phone number over to this new phone. And of course, trying to be the helpful employees, they say, oh, absolutely. They get a little bit of information and then they swap the phone over. After they've done this, the attacker now has your phone. They can get your SMS codes and they can use it to log into your bank. There was a big recent breach in the last couple months where a DevOps engineer had their SMS token stolen because of SIM swapping. Now, there's been a little bit of discussion about potential telecom specific related attacks, something like proxying SMS or intercepting SMS. That's still mostly theoretical, at least here in the US, but it is something you definitely want to be aware of if you operate in a country where the government owns all of the telecom infrastructure and can easily pick off an SMS token code off the wire.
So post-authentication, moving into the attacker has compromised the user through some pre-authentication method or otherwise they have one single session, let's say to the VPN. So what does that attacker want to do? Well, they're going to want to move through that attacker lifecycle. They're going to want to move laterally, escalate their privileges. But of course, to do that, they're going to need to maintain access day in and day out. And if they've logged into the VPN, chances are your VPN sessions expire within, hopefully at most 24 hours. And so they're going to need a way to actually gain control of or adjust the MFA flow for that one user. And of course, they're an attacker. They're going to want to maintain persistence in a stealthy manner. So we're going to seek to do this with as little disruption, as little evidence generation as possible. So when we're thinking about more modern, more newer types of authentication schemes, there's generally going to be a self-enrollment or maybe a self-service portal. And a lot of the times, these portals are going to be behind SSO, or potentially, if you're already on the VPN, not require an additional multi-factor code. So if you've already authenticated through one of those pre-auth techniques or otherwise, you can probably access the self-service portal without any credentials. And so there are a lot of cool things we can do. We've seen a lot of attack groups add what are called backup phones. So you have your primary phone that is yours, and then I add a backup phone, which is mine. And then next time I log in, I can just go ahead and actually specify, please send this push or please send this SMS code to phone number 2 only. And so now no one but me has that code and knows that I've accessed that account. You can also just blow away all the existing tokens and register a new one. And of course, every MFA provider has what are called bypass or backup codes. You could regenerate those, save them, and now you have probably about 20 codes that you can use whenever you want. We've also seen, and it's also been talked about at this con already, some multi-factor solutions that rely on AD attributes, perhaps the phone attribute for the user object. Well, if I'm the attacker, I can just go ahead and change that AD attribute to a new phone number, and now I have multi-factor. And lastly, on the more traditional side of things, this has probably been talked about quite a lot already, but if you have any sort of random number generator type two-factor, it's going to require what's called a seed file, so some cryptographic material to actually prime that random number generator. And a user who's just joined the company or who has a new phone, they need a way of receiving those token files. And what's the easiest solution for that? Email. We've even seen places where companies will send these token files to new employees over personal email. And a lot of the times, personal email doesn't have multi-factor, or we've already talked about organizations who don't have multi-factor for webmail. So all an attacker does is compromises some credentials, logs into the webmail, searches for these files. They have common file format names, and now your two-factor becomes single-factor.
So the last stage here is post-exploitation. So this is usually the aspect that most organizations are concerned about because they typically don't have to engage in any big IR process until they've realized that everything that could have gone wrong has already gone wrong. So this is a scenario when the attacker has everything, well, almost everything. So for those of you who have done red teams or pen tests at more secure, security-conscious clients, you know that MFA is a really, really popular tool that they use to segment sensitive resources away from general domain admin access, right? It is no longer sufficient just to have domain admin. Now you have to do a little extra work. So attackers will get domain admin credentials, usually pretty quickly, and they'll go after some interesting resources that are behind MFA access. So you've got your VPN, so that's a permanent backdoor. They can come in anytime they want. It's really hard to detect. Jump box servers, if you're a tight follower of secure domain administration protocols, a la Sean Metcalf. Password vaults, if credentials are changing daily, you need to go in and get the latest version of it every time you want to use a certain account. And of course, external services, because one of the truths of real-life attackers is oftentimes they're only interested in your mail, because a lot of people send their most sensitive data between emails to each other. So from a very simple post-exploitation attack, you can just go after MFA management. And you can do this several ways, key logging the attacker or key logging the users that are responsible for administering MFA is definitely very effective. But most often organizations have shared accounts and passwords that they store on things like SMB file shares under, say, the IT department, where they store these conveniently for everyone's usage. Now, once you're in, you have a large number of opportunities to get a backdoor in there. You can create a brand new account that's not associated with any other existing user. You can enroll a new token for an existing account. You can enable emergency bypass, so you can generate static codes that can be used in place of the second factor, and you can generate permanent and temporary ones. You can disable the requirement for MFA. This is particularly important because some people don't realize that this is actually a function of modern MFA, especially cloud-based MFA. You can turn off the requirement for MFA for certain users, and well, once you've done that, as long as you have their password, you're good to go. And last but not least, if you're trying to be really stealthy and make the least amount of changes as possible, usually you'll find an account that's not used very often but still has the access you want. You can go in and reset their PIN, you can go generate a temporary static token, and then you have access, right? And you haven't added any new accounts, any new tokens. You're all using just static temporary methods.
So moving on, especially into the cloud, with these modern authentication schemes, we're going to have a lot of different exceptions. We're going to have a lot of complexities. We're also going to have some trust issues. So, one of the things that we like to do is we like to identify if there are any users or any AD groups that are exempted from MFA. Identifying those, and then if we already have domain administrator level access, like Austin was saying, we'll just add users to those groups. Or maybe we'll just create our own MFA exemption group.
Or just use the user account that already exists there, right? If it's already exempted, you don't have to make a change. Just go DC sync their password hash, crack it, and you're good to go.
We're also going to target the server and not the application. And this is really for on-prem things. But let's say you have a CyberArk password vault. That web-based interface probably requires two-factor, I hope. But what might not be immediately evident is that this is just another Windows server in your domain. And it's going to be exposing services like SMB and WMI and maybe even RDP. And now you start thinking, can those services support multi-factor? The answer is no. Well, at least not WMI and SMB. And so how exposed are those services on my network? Can I just, any old workstation, go ahead and mount $C$ if it has admin rights on that box? Well, then I'm just going to go ahead and mount that share, maybe pull the database off the disk directly, and now I'm done.
And another interesting thing to think about, so if you watched Sean Metcalf's fantastic talk, he talks about putting in effort to go after the user that's using the password vault. Well, if you have access to the web application that acts as the man in the middle between the user and the password vault, then you can do some fun things like edit the web code that gets presented to the user on login and access some of the data they're sending over, as well as some of the data that might be sent back. So you don't always have to go after the user in this case. It's often easy enough to go after the server because these deployment guidelines say secure the vault at all costs, and they often are followed, but the web application server doesn't get secured quite as much.
And especially when we're talking about cloud-based MFA or even cloud-based services, there's a lot of trust issues, there is a lot of operational complexities. So we're not going to talk too much about the trust issues today. That's a field of active research for Austin and I, so stay tuned there. But in terms of operational complexities, this multi-factor scheme means that I need to access the cloud all of the time. Whenever I get that Duo push, I need to go to duo.com. Well, what happens when the internet goes down in my office? Am I just going to close up shop for the day? Probably not. I still want my engineers to be able to do their work. I still want to be able to make money. So there are these so-called fail open settings. And this has been talked about a lot, but it's a very important thing to be aware of that most of these solutions have fail open settings, and by default, they may be enabled.
So here is a convenient screenshot from the very helpful Duo ADFS FAQ. It actually tells you a little bit about what it does, but most importantly, it tells you where that setting is stored. So for example, if your ADFS server that currently has Duo installed on it supports remote registry rights with single-factor authentication, hint, hint, it probably does, you can go in and actually change this option yourself very, very, very simply. And as Doug mentioned, this has been talked about quite a bit, actually dating back to 2017, which admittedly I missed the initial posting on. But there's some sources at the bottom that have taken various approaches at looking at this. Obviously, the most famous one is the most recent, so that's Noopy. But yeah, so it's definitely something people have been aware of, but it hasn't percolated until quite now that this is a potential problem, because you can intercept that DNS communication. You can write DNS rules that block it. You can change the host file. There's several different network-specific attacks that this now allows you to do. And most importantly, I don't think most administrators would know if suddenly the failed closed method was changed to failed open.
So us being Mandiant consultants, we don't like to leave everyone completely grim. So we're going to talk about some ways that we can actually improve. How can we defend our MFA authentication scheme from all of these different types of attacks? So when we start thinking about pre-authentication, there's definitely some business operational decisions to be made, right? The first is, how much information do I actually want to expose just to the open internet about the MFA scheme I'm using? Obviously, the best model is no information, but of course that's probably not going to fly. But starting to think about just how much information is out there. Defining the MFA delivery. So lots of these, especially cloud-based solutions, provide a phone call, an SMS code, a push. Start thinking about how many options am I giving my users, and do I actually want to give them all of those options? You know, I'm pretty lazy myself. I know I probably am going to choose the easiest option, which generally is the weakest option. So we start thinking about that. And of course, with any technology, there's going to be logs, and I'm going to want to make sure that I'm ingesting those logs into a SIM or somewhere else, and I'm baselining that activity, looking for things like password sprays, looking for things like geolocation, all that good stuff that you're hopefully already doing with your other logs. And training. I think training is the most important thing here when we're thinking about pre-authentication attacks. So are your users being trained to recognize malicious OAuth applications? Probably not. And is your help desk receiving additional training? And what I mean by additional training is they have a very specific job description. They're going to be fielding a lot of emails. They're going to be fielding a lot of phone calls where people are going to be calling up and saying, I just spilled coffee on my phone. Can I get a new multi-factor code, please? How does your help desk is trained to recognize a real employee from a fake employee? And how can they make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing day in and day out?
I'll give you a hint. Most often it's actually a secret question, which, you know, we've already talked about the problems with.
And of course, specifically with OAuth, making sure that you're aware of what kind of artifacts are being generated in the cloud service provider's logs. So the Unified Audit Log in Office 365, for example, provides an event for a consent, but not much beyond that, oh, someone consented to an application. So not only being aware of what logs are available, but being aware of the limitations of those logs so that you know before an incident happens what your shortcomings are, what your visibility is. When we're thinking about reactive, so something bad has already happened, it's going to follow the traditional playbooks for a lot of social engineering. So we're thinking about blocking email addresses, blocking IP addresses, and blocking domains, and also being able to monitor your infrastructure for callbacks or for resolutions to those domains. So we're not just blocking and forgetting, we're blocking and monitoring. And consider staying abreast of the latest trends, the latest techniques, and asking yourself every time something new drops on Twitter, okay, in my organization, do I have the right logging and the right monitoring to detect this? Or can I just go ahead and block this attempt completely right now? And of course, thinking about these third-party applications again, making sure that you're aware of how you can actually revoke consent to these apps in bulk. It's going to vary from provider to provider.
On the post-authentication side, the first question on the proactive side we have to answer is, what are our session timeouts? If you don't know this, you need to know this. Why? Because when we limit how long a user has access to our environment with a single authentication, we limit how long an attacker has access to our environment. And you want to make it as difficult on the attacker as possible to conduct a reconnaissance and actually try these techniques that are going to backdoor MFA for future access. Second is control the enrollment flow. Have it documented. Share that documentation with your help desk, with your users and your admins. Know exactly what is suspicious when it comes to how and when and why a new token is being enrolled in your system. Minimize self-management. Self-enrollment is kind of one of those necessary emails for large organizations because you don't have enough IT staff to support 200,000 users across the globe. So minimize the effectiveness of it, require help desk approvals, train help desk to spot suspicious activations or enrollments, and then finally harden the alerting process. Make sure you know when a bypass token is generated, when someone added a secondary phone but kept the first phone operational, right? Reactive. Know how to terminate and revoke sessions. Believe it or not, there are still administrators that if you say the attacker has logged into your VPN, they don't know how to go and shut that session off and revoke access. Identify logs for SSO activities. So if you're using something like Okta, know when they logged in, how they logged in, where they logged in from, and more importantly, what other resources they pushed that token out to. Self-management and enrollment logs, you have to know when people are adding or changing enrollment. Blocking procedure is pretty typical. You know, it's a standard IR procedure. And then, of course, backup code. So if you have some reason to believe that someone has backdoored or changed key material in your MFA enrollment process for a particular user, you have to know how to revoke it. So if they have a bypassed code, know how to turn it off. Know how to change over tokens quickly, because oftentimes you'll have to.
And I think another important thing is, especially with SSO, being aware of what applications you have that actually are going to trust that SSO token. I recently did a pen test where there was a single sign-on portal that was single factor, and then there was an HR self-administration portal that they thought was two-factor, but it turns out it also trusted that SSO token. So by just browsing to that portal with my already authenticated SSO token, I now bypassed their two-factor, and this was something that they had no idea about because the SSO was set up years and years ago. Now, when we're thinking about post-exploitation, so everything has already gone wrong, start thinking about those critical assets. So on your internal network, are your critical assets protected with multi-factor? They probably should be. And if they already are, start thinking about those additional ways of accessing the box. So those Windows protocols, or maybe it's Linux, those Linux protocols, and deciding, are those protected by multi-factor? Can they be protected by multi-factor? And if not, can I limit access to those protocols? And removing your information leaks inside the environment. So we're talking about places where these MFA credentials are being stored, guides and documentation about actually administering MFA. And break glass accounts, I think, are extremely important here. So many organizations are going to have these accounts where they can be used to access two-factor protected resources without two-factor. And these are for your disaster recovery scenarios. But a lot of organizations, they're going to need to test this. So maybe the account is going to be authenticated to a couple of machines. Maybe it's just stored in AD. Ideally, it's written down on paper and put away for that rainy day, but usually that's not the case. I've seen plenty of admins save this password into their Outlook notes, and then I just need to log in and go ahead and find it. And then alerting on MFA group adjustments. This is really important. So we see a lot of organizations that do have this in place, so anytime a user is added or removed from that AD accepted group. However, the alerts usually go to the IT operations team. And the IT operations team might see this alert, and maybe they're a team of 100 people. Are they going to go ahead and check every time this alert is generated, or are they just going to write it off as business as usual? Now, if that alert instead went to the security team, or maybe in addition went to the security team, there may have been a different outcome to this type of attack. And when we're thinking reactively, we just want to make sure that we understand the MFA model that's in place, understand how we can reset it completely, not just from a user perspective, but also from the administrative perspective, and making sure our critical assets are part of any investigation. So just because your internal or your external asset is protected by multi-factor doesn't mean that we can leave it out of scope during our incident response investigation. We need to make sure that we are aware that multi-factor can be bypassed. We need to make sure that we're still looking at those resources, not just from maybe an application perspective, but also from the server. And just being aware that it's not a silver bullet anymore.
So for those of you viewing at home, this is a handy dandy guide to all the information that you should have on hand with respect to your MFA accounts. This is the stuff that's going to be critical when you have an active incident and critical for doing proactive hunting of malicious access. Yes, that's right. Take a picture of it. It'll be available online too. So, oh, sorry. I'll leave that up for 5 more seconds. There we go. All right, so conclusion. What did we learn today?
So we learned some things, I hope. There are a lot of things out there that don't support multi-factor authentication, whether by design or otherwise. So we talked about third-party applications from the cloud, so OAuth applications and OAuth abuse. We talked a lot about legacy protocols. Actually, EWS is not one of them, but there's ActiveSync, there's IMAP, there's POP. There's all these protocols for other services that just don't support multi-factor because they're too old. And there's also Windows protocols and Linux protocols, but Windows protocols, especially like WMI or SMB, are very important. We learned that MFA can suck to configure properly. It's really a pain. And even if we do configure it properly, there's always going to be exceptions. There's always going to be those secretaries or those C-level guys who just can't be bothered with multi-factor, and they make enough money that they can tell you that they don't want to bother with multi-factor.
So, at the end of the day, one thing that we really want everyone to know is that real-world attackers, not just red teamers like Doug and I, but real-world attackers, APT threats, have several tricks in their bag now to backdoor and maintain access to MFA systems. And while historically organizations have ignored it, they figured once I get it set up, it takes care of itself. Well, that's not sufficient anymore. We need to be paying more attention to it. We have to protect it as a critical service. If you're not investing at least as much resources into protecting your MFA as you are into your domain controller, you are misappropriating your resources. So here at the very end, the 2 big drive home points. Start thinking about proactive measures to detect when MFA is being mucked with, when someone's doing something they shouldn't, and develop reactive strategies to incorporate MFA access into your IR process. Having said that, we hope you guys learned something, had a good time. We love being here. This is our first time at DerbyCon. You guys have been great. Please feel free to hit us up if you have any questions, but otherwise, thank you so much for showing up at 10 a.m. on a Sunday.
Well done, sir.
Oh, I thought you were going to fist bump me.
Oh, well, yeah, that too.
Yeah, you did a good job.
That should be online. Looking at be additional information. It should also be more online.
Yeah, I mean, that's yeah.
So I people have the video. Yeah, and then
Travel
other
users, questions, what you're concerned about.
yeah, like
I didn't really
require a lot more meeting other talks to give your the plan is to keep raising the rights so that at least if you can make talk to people. Things like that last time just feel like a one-man band.
Yeah.
We're not doing high stuff. Actually,
Yeah.
So,